On the night of December 17th, 2013, 20-year-old Heather Elvis drove home after finishing her shift at work. It was the week before Christmas in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. Holiday lights glowed faintly across neighborhoods, while the cold air carried a stillness that felt almost heavy. For most families, this night would have been ordinary, but for Heather, it would mark the beginning of a mystery that still haunts her family, her community, and investigators to this very day. Sometime after midnight, Heather's phone rang. On the other end was a man she knew well, a man who had become both intoxicating and dangerous in her young life. Sidney Moorer, a 37-year-old married father 3. Heather had broken off the affair weeks earlier, after discovering Sidney's wife Tammy knew about their relationship. But now, Sidney was calling again. Heather answered. Their conversation lasted minutes. He told her he wanted to see her. He told her to meet him. At 1:30 a.m., Heather drove out into the night. It was the last time anyone would ever see her alive. The next morning, her car was found abandoned at a desolate boat landing along the Waccamaw River. The driver's seat empty, her keys gone, her phone silent. Heather herself was nowhere to be found. To this day, Heather's body has never been recovered. And yet, the case against Sidney and Tammy Moorer unraveled into one of the most disturbing and emotionally charged trials in South Carolina's history. It is a story of youth and innocence colliding with jealousy, obsession, and manipulation. A story of a young woman caught in a web of deceit, a web that would ultimately cost her everything. Before the headlines, before the trials, Heather Elvis was not a name known across the country. She was simply Heather, a young woman full of life, working 2 jobs, one at the Tilted Kilt, a local restaurant, and another as a makeup artist at salon. Friends describe her as fun, quirky, a little shy at first, but magnetic once you got to know her. She loved photography. She loved the small joys of life, laughing with her sisters, taking goofy selfies with friends, and dreaming of bigger things. At just 20 years old, Heather was figuring herself out, stepping into adulthood, and exploring the independence she craved since leaving high school. But like so many young people, Heather was also vulnerable, caught between excitement and uncertainty, testing the waters of relationships she wasn't fully prepared for. That vulnerability would bring Sidney Moorer into her orbit, and it was Sidney and his wife Tammy who would ultimately define the darkest chapter of Heather's life. Sidney Moorer was nearly twice Heather's age. A repairman by trade, he presented himself as confident, experienced, and attentive. Heather, like many young women searching for validation, was flattered. To her, Sidney was charming. But Sidney was also married, with 3 children at home. Their affair was a secret. Stolen phone calls, late-night meetings, the thrill of something forbidden. But secrets have a way of surfacing. Tammy Moorer, Sidney's wife, found out, and Tammy was not a woman who forgave easily. By all accounts, Tammy was controlling, possessive, and fiercely protective of her marriage. She monitored Sidney's phone, demanded his loyalty, and made it clear Heather Elvis was a threat that had to be eliminated from their lives. Heather confided in friends that Tammy harassed her, threatening messages, angry phone calls, intimidation that left Heather rattled. But despite the tension, Heather didn't fully grasp the danger she was in. She was 20 years old, and in her mind, this was relationship drama, messy but survivable. She couldn't have known that Sidney and Tammy were plotting something much darker. And so we return to that night in December, the night when Sidney called again, the night Heather picked up the phone. For 47 chilling minutes, Heather stayed on that call. Investigators would later piece together her movements, her phone pinging cell towers, her car heading toward the river landing. At 3:41 a.m., her phone activity stopped, forever, when her car was discovered locked and abandoned, with no signs of Heather nearby. Panic set in. This was no case of a runaway. This was no young woman deciding to vanish. Heather had been taken. And the prime suspects? The very couple whose jealousy and obsession had consumed Heather's life in the weeks before her disappearance. Sidney and Tammy Moorer. This is the story of Heather Elvis, a young woman full of light, drawn into the darkness of a toxic love triangle, a family's desperate fight for answers, and a trial that would expose betrayal, obsession, and the chilling lengths people will go to protect their secrets. Before the headlines, before the endless search parties and courtroom battles, there was Heather Elvis. Heather was born on June 30th, 1993, in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. She grew up as the oldest daughter in a close-knit family. Her parents, Terry and Debbie Elvis, were hard-working, faith-driven people who raised their children with love, discipline, and encouragement. From a young age, Heather was known for her creativity. She loved art, makeup, and photography. Family photos show a girl with bright eyes and a warm smile, a child who loved to laugh, tease her siblings, and dream about her future. Heather's family later described her as the light of the room, not because she demanded attention, but because she radiated it naturally. She wasn't perfect, of course. Like most teenagers, she had moments of rebellion, stubbornness, and searching for independence. But of those closest to her, Heather was compassionate, funny, and full of potential. By 2013, Heather was 20 years old. She had graduated from high school and, like many young adults, was navigating that difficult phase between adolescence and adulthood. She didn't yet have everything figured out, but she was working toward it. She held jobs at the Tilted Kilt, a local restaurant where she served tables, and as a makeup artist at a beauty salon. She was still deciding what career path to pursue, but she had an eye for beauty and detail. Friends remembered her as someone who loved making others feel confident and beautiful, whether through a new hairstyle, a makeover, or simply her encouraging words. Heather was also exploring her independence. She had recently moved into her first apartment, decorated it with personal touches, and enjoyed the freedom of living on her own. Like many young women her age, Heather went on dates, stayed out late with friends, and posted light-hearted updates on social media. She was in every way a normal 20-year-old, balancing work, friendships, and dreams of a future that seemed wide open. It was during this chapter of independence that Heather crossed paths with Sidney Moorer, a man nearly twice her age. Sidney was 37, married to Tammy Moorer, and the father of 3 children. Sidney worked as a maintenance and repair technician. On the surface, he was an ordinary man, quiet, somewhat reserved, a family man in appearance. But beneath the surface, there was turmoil in his marriage. Tammy, his wife, was known to be controlling, quick-tempered, and deeply suspicious of infidelity. At some point in 2013, Heather met Sidney, reportedly through her job at the Tilted Kilt. He was older, more experienced, and he paid attention to her. For Heather, still figuring out her place in the world, Sidney's interest was flattering. What began as casual interaction soon escalated into an affair. For Heather, the affair carried a mix of excitement and danger. She confided in friends about Sidney, telling them she felt a strong connection but also unease. He was married, after all. She knew it couldn't last. But Sidney pursued her, and for a time, Heather allowed herself to be swept up in the secrecy. She was young, impressionable, and craving affection. Sidney, for his part, seemed to enjoy the thrill of being desired by someone younger, someone who looked at him with admiration. But the secrecy wouldn't stay secret for long. When Tammy discovered her husband's affair, her anger zeroed in not on Sidney, but on Heather. Tammy reportedly began sending Heather threatening text messages. In one, she mocked Heather, calling her names and accusing her of ruining marriages. Friends later recalled how shaken Heather was by Tammy's hostility. At one point, Heather told a friend she was afraid of Tammy. She knew the older woman was furious, and that made her uneasy. But Heather was also trying to move on. By November 2013, she had ended the affair with Sidney. She even went on a date with another man, attempting to leave the toxic relationship behind. What Heather didn't realize was that Sidney wasn't ready to let her go, and Tammy, still seething with jealousy, wasn't ready to forgive. This was the backdrop leading into December 2013. Heather Elvis was a young woman trying to rebuild her life after a messy affair, just weeks before Christmas. She was working, dating, spending time with friends, and preparing for a new year. But behind the scenes, the Moorers were watching, waiting, and planning. Heather couldn't have known that within weeks, she would vanish into the night, that a single phone call from Sidney would pull her back into the very danger she thought she'd escaped, and that her disappearance would set off one of South Carolina's most infamous true crime investigations. By the fall of 2013, Heather Elvis was standing at a crossroads in her young life. What had started as a thrilling, secretive affair with Sidney Moorer had soured into fear, tension, and regret. Heather had ended things. She wanted to move on. But ending an affair is rarely simple, especially when the other person and his family refused to let go. When Tammy Moorer discovered her husband's betrayal, her fury came with precision and cruelty. Tammy wasn't just angry, she was vengeful. She took direct aim at Heather, the younger woman she blamed for everything. Heather began receiving a series of threatening messages. Some were mocking, others were explicitly hostile. Tammy's rage spilled onto social media. She posted taunts and accusations publicly, making sure Heather knew she was being watched. In one message, Tammy referred to Heather as nothing more than a homewrecker. Friends said Heather tried to brush it off at first, but the harassment weighed on her. She confided to those close to her that she was afraid of Tammy. She knew the older woman had a temper, and the power of experience and influence that Heather simply didn't. Despite the tension, Heather made genuine efforts to reclaim her life. She started dating again. She spent time with friends, laughing, sharing meals, and talking about her hopes for the future. In late November 2013, Heather even went on a first date with a man her friends thought was a healthier choice. Someone closer to her age, someone not entangled in secrets and lies. That night, she sent playful messages to her roommate, Brianna Warman, sharing the little details of her evening. For once, she seemed lighthearted again, as if she had finally shaken off Sidney's shadow. But lurking behind that fragile peace was a storm that hadn't passed. Not long after Heather tried to move on, Sidney reinserted himself into her life. Tammy, furious but unwilling to let her husband out of her control, allegedly demanded that Sidney make things right. On December 17, 2013, Sidney called Heather from a payphone. Investigators would later uncover this detail, a calculated move to avoid being traced. Why did Sidney call? Was it a plea for reconciliation, a final goodbye, or a part of something far more sinister? What's certain is that Heather picked up. That night, Heather was at her apartment. Around 1:30 a.m., she spoke on the phone with Sidney. What was said during that conversation remains a haunting mystery. Shortly after, Heather called her roommate Brianna, who was out of town for the holidays. The two chatted briefly, Heather sounding somewhat conflicted, somewhat restless. Then, Heather got into her car, a green 2001 Dodge Intrepid, and drove out into the night. Phone records would later show that Heather's cell activity placed her near Peachtree Landing, a remote boat landing along the Waccamaw River, around 3 a.m. And then, the trail went dark. Heather Elvis was never seen again. By the next morning, Heather's family couldn't reach her. Calls went unanswered. Messages were ignored. Her green Dodge Intrepid was found abandoned at Peachtree Landing. Inside, police found her belongings, but no sign of Heather. It was as if she had simply vanished into the night. But to her parents, Terry and Debbie, this was no mystery. They knew instantly. Heather hadn't just walked away. Something had happened. And as police began to peel back the layers of her final hours, one name rose again and again: Sidney Moorer. The affair had ended. The threats had escalated. The payphone call had lured Heather back into Sidney's orbit. And now, Heather was gone. What happened next would turn the Moorers' lives, and the entire Myrtle Beach community, into the center of one of South Carolina's most infamous true crime cases. When Heather Elvis's car was discovered abandoned at Peachtree Landing on December 19, 2013, the scene raised more questions than it answered. The car sat in the dark, eerily silent, with no signs of a struggle inside. But its presence in such a remote location, miles away from Heather's apartment, was a glaring red flag. Detectives knew immediately. Young women don't vanish without reason. Investigators started with the basics. Heather's cell phone records revealed a troubling pattern. Her phone had pinged off towers that placed her near the Moore home, and later near Peachtree Landing. The final activity occurred just after 3:40 a.m. on December 18th. And then, silence. Detectives also pulled surveillance footage from nearby businesses. One camera captured Heather's green Dodge, Intrepid, heading toward the river landing in the early morning hours. But it never showed her leaving. One of the first pieces of evidence to raise suspicion was the payphone call made to Heather on the night she disappeared. Police traced it back to a station not far from the Moorer residence. When confronted, Sidney Moorer admitted he had called Heather that night, but he insisted it was harmless, just a casual conversation, a moment of weakness. To detectives, that excuse didn't hold up. Why would a married man use a payphone in the middle of the night to call the woman he'd been having an affair with? And why did Heather vanish only hours later? As the investigation widened, Tammy Moorer's role became impossible to ignore. Detectives learned that Tammy had been obsessively monitoring her husband after discovering the affair. She had installed tracking apps on his phone. She sent Heather harassing texts. She publicly humiliated her husband online, even forcing him to write a bizarre message on social media declaring his loyalty to her. Friends of Heather told police that she was terrified of Tammy, terrified enough to believe Tammy might do something drastic. This information shifted the investigation's focus from Heather's possible voluntary disappearance to something far darker: foul play. While detectives zeroed in on the Moorers, Heather's family launched a massive search effort. Volunteers scoured the marshlands, riverbanks, and wooded areas around Peachtree Landing. Flyers with Heather's smiling face went up all across Myrtle Beach. Terry Elvis, her father, became the tireless face of the search. He pleaded with the community for help, standing before cameras with a voice trembling between grief and determination. "Somebody knows what happened to my daughter," he said, "and I won't stop until we find her." Meanwhile, police conducted interviews, collected digital evidence, and built a timeline. Phone records showed a string of calls and texts between Sidney, Tammy, and Heather in the hours before her disappearance. Neighbors reported seeing unusual activity at the Moorer home in the early morning hours. Bit by bit, the evidence pointed in one direction. By late January 2014, law enforcement had enough to act. On February 21st, 2014, police moved in. Sidney and Tammy Moorer were arrested and charged with kidnapping and obstruction of justice in connection with Heather's disappearance. The news sent shockwaves through the Myrtle Beach community. Crowds gathered as the Moorers were led away in handcuffs, faces stony, refusing to answer questions. For Heather's family, the arrests were both a relief and a torment. Relief that someone was being held accountable. Torment because Heather herself was still missing. Prosecutors laid out the foundation of their case. The payphone call Sidney made to Heather just before she vanished. The harassing messages Tammy sent in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. The digital evidence placing the Moorers near Peachtree Landing that night. But without a body, the case was fragile. The Moorers' defense attorneys argued there was no proof Heather was even dead. No proof of a crime, only speculation. Still, the prosecution pressed forward. The evidence was circumstantial, the charges controversial. But behind every document, every testimony, was the same chilling truth. Heather Elvis had disappeared into the night, and the last people to contact her were Sidney and Tammy Moorer. And the more investigators uncovered, the clearer it became. This wasn't just a tragic disappearance. It was the unraveling of marriage, an affair, and a young life caught in the crossfire. The disappearance of Heather Elvis didn't just devastate her family. It ignited one of the most sensational trials South Carolina had ever seen. Not only because of the mystery of her vanishing, but also because of the toxic mix of obsession, betrayal, and lies that spilled into the courtroom. By 2014, authorities had zeroed in on Sidney and Tammy Moorer as the prime suspects. The affair between Heather and Sidney was no longer a rumor whispered in dark corners of Myrtle Beach. It was front-page news, and the prosecution painted it as a dangerous spark that set off everything to come. Assistant Solicitor Nancy Livesay would later declare, "This case is about an obsession. It's about control. And it's about a young woman who paid the ultimate price." The evidence, however, was not straightforward. There was no body, no murder weapon, no crime scene. What prosecutors had instead was a trail of circumstantial clues. Heather's abandoned car, suspicious cell phone pings, and surveillance videos that seemed to put the Moorers in the right place at the right time. But the centerpiece of the case became the phone call, the one Heather had received in the middle of the night, just hours before she disappeared. That call had come from a payphone near the Moorers' home, and records showed Sidney had been the one to make it. Why would a married man, already entangled in a turbulent affair, use a payphone to contact Heather Elvis in the dead of night? The prosecution argued it was part of a carefully laid trap, a lure designed to get Heather out of her apartment, to meet Sidney one final time. In 2016, Sidney Moorer stood trial for the kidnapping of Heather Elvis. The courtroom was electric. On one side sat Heather's grieving family, her father Terry, her mother Debbie, and her younger sister Morgan, who had endured years of waiting for answers. On the other side were the Moorers, tight-lipped and defiant, clinging to their innocence. Prosecutors presented testimony from investigators and cell tower experts. They mapped out the timeline. Heather's phone stopping at the Peachtree Landing area, Sidney's phone pinging nearby, and then silence. The haunting silence of a young woman's life being cut short. But Sidney's defense fought back hard. They argued there was no physical evidence linking him to a crime. They claimed Heather could have run away voluntarily, even suggesting she had the means and desire to escape her life. It was a theory Heather's family found cruel and unthinkable. After days of deliberation, the jury deadlocked. Mistrial. The Elvis family was crushed. Heather was still gone, and the man they believed responsible had just slipped through the cracks of reasonable doubt. If Sidney's trial was tense, Tammy's trial in 2018 was explosive. Tammy, the wife who had discovered the affair, was portrayed as the driving force behind Heather's disappearance. Prosecutors painted her as a woman consumed with rage and humiliation, desperate to eliminate her husband's lover at any cost. Jurors heard how Tammy had harassed Heather through texts and calls, branding her with vicious insults. In one message, Tammy sneered, "You're nothing but a psycho whore. You will never have my husband." Prosecutors argued Tammy's jealousy escalated into something far darker, a calculated plot to make Heather disappear. The most chilling evidence came from surveillance footage that captured the Moorers' truck heading toward Peachtree Landing, the very place where Heather's car was later found abandoned. And then, the testimony of Heather's friends and co-workers. They describe how Heather had been full of life, with no reason to vanish. She had just started a new job, had dreams of becoming a makeup artist, and still spoke daily with her family. The defense once again clung to the absence of a body. Without proof of death, they argued, how can anyone say with certainty what had happened to Heather Elvis? But this time, the jury was not swayed. After tense deliberations, they delivered their verdict. Tammy Moorer was sentenced to 30 years in prison for kidnapping Heather Elvis. For Heather's family, the verdict was bittersweet. They had fought for justice for nearly 5 years, and now, at least one of Heather's tormentors would spend decades behind bars. But the question that haunted them still remained. Where was Heather? Without her body, there was no closure, no gravesite to visit, no final goodbye. At a press conference, Heather's father Terry spoke with quiet dignity but unmistakable pain. "We got justice today, but we did not get Heather back. We still live every day not knowing where she is, and that's the hardest part." As for Sidney, he was retried in 2019 and convicted of kidnapping. He too received 30 years in prison. Together, the Moorers were now behind bars. But for Heather's family, it was only partial justice. The trials had revealed the tangled web of lies, jealousy, and obsession that led to their daughter's disappearance. But the final chapter of her story was still unwritten. When the gavel fell and both Sidney and Tammy Moorer were sentenced to 30 years each for the kidnapping of Heather Elvis, many in the Myrtle Beach community felt relief. The trials had dragged on for years. Each new headline reopened the wound of Heather's disappearance. Now, at least, the people believed justice had been served. But for Heather's family, there was no relief, no peace, because Heather's body had never been found. And in the quiet hours of the night, that single fact gnawed at them like an open wound that refused to heal. Her mother, Debbie, would later tell reporters, "It's like living in a nightmare you never wake up from. We know she's gone, but we don't know where she is. We don't know how it ended for her. And every day we have to live with those questions." Justice, however, was not the end. The Moorers refused to quietly accept their fate. Almost immediately, they filed appeals. Their attorneys argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that their clients had been railroaded by public outrage and media attention. In 2021, Sidney Moorer's legal team petitioned for a new trial, insisting that prosecutors had failed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Heather was dead, let alone that the Moorers were responsible. The court, however, rejected the appeal. Tammy Moorer also pursued every possible legal avenue, but her conviction stood firm. Judges repeatedly emphasized that while no body was ever recovered, the circumstantial evidence was powerful and the jury had spoken. Still, the Moorers have not given up their fight. To this day, both continue to maintain their innocence, even from behind bars. While the court battles dragged on, the community of Myrtle Beach refused to let Heather's memory fade. Every year, on the anniversary of her disappearance, vigils were held. Candles lit the night sky. Friends and strangers gathered at Peachtree Landing, the last known place Heather was seen, to honor her life. A small plaque with Heather's name was placed near the site. For her family, it was both comforting and devastating. A reminder of her presence and her absence. Heather's case also inspired broader conversations about relationships, power dynamics, and the dangers of obsession. What began as an affair between a young woman and a married man spiraled into something no one could have predicted. A deadly cocktail of jealousy and control. Heather's parents, Debbie and Terry, have carried themselves with extraordinary grace in the years since. They continue to speak about their daughter, her laughter, her dreams, her love for life. Her younger sister Morgan has grown into adulthood with the shadow of Heather's disappearance always at her side. She has said she carries her sister's memory into everything she does, striving to live fully and honor the life Heather was denied. For the Elvis family, every day is still a search, not only for Heather's remains, but for answers. The truth of what happened on the night of December 18th, 2013, remains locked away, known only to Heather and the Moorers. And unless one of them chooses to speak, that truth may never see the light of day. It is this silence that keeps the case alive in the public imagination. Heather Elvis is not just another missing person. She is a symbol of how fragile life is. How one decision, one relationship, one late-night phone call can alter the course of everything. Heather Elvis was just 20 years old when she disappeared. She was full of dreams, with a future still unwritten. She deserved to grow, to love, to live. Instead, her story became one of obsession, jealousy, and betrayal. And yet, even in her absence, Heather's light endures. In the vigils, in the prayers of strangers, and in the unwavering fight of her family, Heather Elvis remains more than just a name and a headline. She is a daughter, a sister, a friend. And until her body is found, her case will remain one of the most haunting mysteries in South Carolina history.